Thank you, Jeanette. It's beautiful. So it's great to be with you all today. I'm having so much fun doing my Sunday lessons. You know, just having the focus on the Sermon on the Mount has really helped me focus in my own life and to understand more powerfully how really transformational the teachings of Jesus are in our world, and how transformational these teachings were in the world in his time as well. So today we're going to be focusing on one section of Matthew, and I put a tiny bit of it here in the bulletin, and I'm just going to read this piece because I'm going to be talking a little bit about this particular focus that Jesus had. You have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. You have heard it said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. So I want to kind of put a little context around this and around Jesus speaking. We call it the Sermon on the Mount because he had gone up to a mountaintop and the disciples had followed him, and he was speaking from this mountaintop. And it was quite a long discourse. If we look at the Sermon on the Mount, it's not something that just probably happened in one day, probably happened over time. Matthew, who is the author of this particular book in the Bible, the Gospel, was actually one of Jesus's disciples. And so it's these people who are writing had knowledge of what was going on and passed it on down. So we're hearing the way Jesus was explaining how he had received the Spirit of God at this time and place. And remember, Jesus was Jewish, and so he came out of the Jewish culture. And what we begin to understand, the more we really understand who Jesus was and how he taught what came to him as the Spirit descended to him, we begin to see a contrast between what was at the time the conventional wisdom in the Jewish culture that he was raised in, and what Jesus was trying to bring to people as a new wisdom teaching. And it's really, it's powerful to begin to understand kind of the differences in these two wisdoms, conventional wisdom and the wisdom that Jesus was bringing. He often talked about how we're on a path, we're on a, it's a spiritual path, but it's the path of the wise one and it's the path of the foolish one. What Jesus was doing when he was teaching, especially in these couple paragraphs that I've brought out here, he was using kind of a flipping around of what we commonly know as wisdom. And I don't know if you want to call it a paradox or simply just, it's almost like a brain scramble for us. Because you don't think conventional wisdom wouldn't say if somebody slapped you on the cheek that you should turn your other cheek. Or if somebody wanted to take your money, that you should give them more money. If they wanted to take part of your clothing, that you should take off your coat and give them to, right? Or if somebody said, oh, you've got to walk a mile, and you'd say, oh, no, I'm going to walk too. So he was scrambling things for people in a way that what first thing it did, it really got their attention. So it's interesting. I've been reading some of my favorite books. I kind of got back to this one book, and I don't know if I probably over the years have spoken to you about Marcus Borg. Marcus Borg was not a unity person per se. He wasn't a unity minister. He actually was raised in the Lutheran tradition, which is all about grace, that we're saved by grace. not by the works that we do. We're saved by grace. But he actually found unity taking him farther in his spiritual journey and became kind of almost like a biographer and a commentator on the unity teachings, and especially the teachings of Jesus. And this particular book is called Meeting Jesus Again for the First Time. It's one of my favorite books that really helps us understand who Jesus was in his time. Marcus Borg talks about Jesus as being a spirit mediator. He was one who mediated through spirit what was happening in the world. And Jesus came as a wisdom teacher to explain and help people know more deeply what really is our reality. What's the reality of who we are? And we would say that in unity, that we are spiritual beings, right, having a human experience. That's the same information that Jesus came at that time to the Jewish culture to teach, that wisdom that we are made in the image and likeness of this spiritual energy, and that the energy of the divine is everywhere present, activated for us as us, to create good and blessings in our life. So Jesus came as this mediator to help people understand. He was almost like, we could think of him almost like a shaman. And when you look back at some of the Jewish prophets were also the similar kind of spiritual mediators. Like Elisha was very much like that. Some of the prophets who were creating major miracles in the Jewish tradition were kind of precursors to Jesus. So thinking about it in this way, as one who is kind of piercing what we know as physical reality and helping people understand there's a different reality. I would like to call that reality the reality of our consciousness, the state of consciousness that we live from. To say that that's really what Jesus was constantly helping people understand. What's the consciousness are you living from? What's that state of reality that you're holding as true for yourself, and also for the guy who slapped you, for the guy who took your cloak? So it's very interesting to kind of look back at what was the conventional wisdom at the time when Jesus arose. And I think that the reason I find this so compelling right now is because, in a sense, we're living in this same conventional wisdom in our world right now, especially in our country, with what's going on with what people are calling Christian nationalism. It's very, very similar to what was happening during first century Judaism, when that was happening and when Jesus arose on the planet. And so it's important for us to begin to understand where this came from and what it is. So the eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. We've all heard that saying before, and that means, everybody would be blind and toothless if that's what we did, which is just kind of the joke. But it's interesting to know that this teaching came from the Old Testament. It came from 3 different chapters in the Old Testament. And I was actually shocked when I read it, and I'm going to read a couple of them to you. I won't read all of them. But the first one I'm going to read to you is from Exodus. I couldn't get my Bible because I didn't have my glasses, but I typed it out. So this is Exodus 21. When people who are fighting injure a pregnant woman so that there is a miscarriage, and yet no further harm follows. Just listen to that. The one responsible shall be fined what the woman's husband demands, paying as much as the judges determine. If any harm follows, you shall give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, and stripe for stripe. This is Exodus. This is the first, very beginning of the Bible, of the Old Testament. So this eye for an eye, this what we would call even exchange. If somebody hurts your foot, you get to hurt their foot. So, and not to mention the pregnant woman harm. I don't know how we measure that, based on your husband's demand. But anyway, all of this kind of thing is kind of old thinking, but a lot of this is going on in our culture right now. So the next one is Leviticus. This one is, anyone who maims another shall suffer the same injury in return. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. The injury inflicted is the injury to be suffered. So this was the conventional wisdom of the time. One more. So this was about a man who was an Egyptian, and he had blasphemed the name of the Lord. The witness is a false witness, having testified falsely against another man. Then you shall do to the false witness just as the false witness has meant to do to the other. So you shall purge the evil from your midst. The rest shall hear and be afraid, and a crime such as that, as this shall never again be committed among you. Show no pity for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. This was tough stuff. And you can imagine that people who believed this kind of teaching saw their God as what? A judge, very vengeful. This was the conventional wisdom. And it was based on, we talk about the law of even exchange. That's the idea that somebody puts out your eye, you get to put theirs out. Somebody slaps you, you get to slap them back. This law of even exchange is really about following if you follow certain requirements, you'll be rewarded. But if you fail to follow those requirements, you will be punished. And the punishment shall equal whatever it was that you failed to do. So it's a system based on reward and punishment. Reward and punishment. Like there's a certain rule that you have to follow, and if you follow that rule, then you will be rewarded. If you don't follow that rule, you will be punished. And clearly the punishment was supposed to fit the crime. We've heard that one too. But Jesus came with a very, very, very different message. He came with a very different message. Even that conventional wisdom that my friend Marcus Borg talks about, which was, it's not so much about the works, which would have been what the old law was, how you show up physically in the world and what you do and what you say is how you're judged. In the early Protestant church, and Luther brought this in, it's not by works, it's not by the works we do, but we're saved by grace. There's this kind of grace that comes upon us if we're the chosen people, and by that we're saved. And then grace became translated as, well, if you have faith. And if you have faith, that's our faith, you're going to be saved. But if you don't have our faith, what? You're out of the club. So all this energy, this old kind of conventional wisdom, which was very much about duality, it's about us and them, it's about right and wrong, it's about reward and punishment. All this was this conventional wisdom that was there in the world when Jesus came. But Jesus came to bring an alternative wisdom. And in a sense, he was very subversive. I mean, Jesus was such a radical. And I think that being a unity student, a unitic, you have to see yourself as a little bit radical in the world right now. Do you feel that? That the way you think about things and the way you see the world is different from maybe the people that live down the street, who have a different understanding. Part of it is because we're so immersed in this conventional wisdom, which comes out of our culture. And, we come out of a long kind of Christian culture that's very denominational based. It's based on the church. It's interesting because one of the things that Jesus seems to be talking about a lot is seeing with a new eye. He talks a lot about the eye. He says the eye is the lamp of the soul. So part of his calling for us in the world is to begin to shift our perception from what is outside to what is going on inside. And when I first was kind of working on this talk, I was looking at all the metaphysical symbols of eye and teeth, and I'm like, I could really go kind of crazy about like teeth or how you chew things up, and it nourishes the body. But the eye, I thought, was a really interesting thing, because Jesus is often talking about the eye and how powerful it is to see things in a different way. And I was thinking about the idea that if somebody were to hurt our eye, not the physical eye, but our spiritual eye. And think about that. We often do. Don't you find your spiritual, what you believe to be true and how you see and know the world is how you see through your spiritual eye? Don't you often find that what you believe and how you see the world is being wounded? I feel it when I just turn on the news. It's like there's a culture that doesn't want to see the connection that we have with one another, the connection that we have with nature, just this interconnected web of life, which is the truth of what Jesus came to remind us of, that we live in this matrix of a universe where we're all connected to one another. So if the spiritual eye that we are, that perception that we have of who we are and how we show up in the world is wounded, how do we respond? How do we respond? And Jesus is really giving us some tools on how to respond. It's very, very interesting, because the other thing about Jesus that is, I think, really powerful is how much authority he claimed for himself. Remember, he's like a 30-year-old man, son of a carpenter. He's speaking to massive crowds of people, and he has this authority to say, you have heard it said, meaning all the chief priests and the Sadducees and the Pharisees, this is the law. This is how they've told you. It's an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And he says, but I say. So he's like claiming something completely radical and completely different. And I think that's part of what's going on for us in our world right now, and the need that we have as individuals to literally claim the truth that we know and not get caught up in the eye for an eye, not just in our physicality of an eye for an eye, with the words that we speak or the actions we take, but at the level of consciousness. This is where the spiritual eye can be impacted. If our inner being is impacted in that way, we have to take a look and see what is it inside me that allows me to like shrink back or not be able to speak or feel like I need to retaliate. And Jesus was very clear about that, wasn't he? He was very clear about what we need to do. And it was the opposite of what everyone else is telling us to do. So I was looking at this a little bit more about this idea of turn the other cheek, give him your tunic. And I was remembering my teachings when I traveled to India, that one of the main teachings that I've been given is this understanding that we are always in either one of two states of consciousness. We're either in a state of consciousness where we're feeling upset, we're anxious, we're confused, we're afraid, we're over here in sort of, you could say it's negative, but it's basically some sort of stressful state of consciousness. Or we're in a state of no stress. We're in a place of peacefulness, we're in a place of awareness of who we are, we're in a place of knowing the truth about who we are as spiritual beings, and also knowing that the people around us have that same quality of spirituality within them. They may not be open to it and seeing it about themselves, but so these two states of consciousness, and I think that's part of what Jesus is reminding us in this particular part of Matthew. When he says, you have heard it said, it's an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. It's a world of duality in the outer. What he's saying is, it's time for us to take a look inside and see the duality that's going on inside us and heal that so that we can be living from a place of truth, knowing the truth of who we are in the world as spiritual beings. And I've been thinking a lot about this lately, just kind of things happening in my own experience. When you have a situation in your life where maybe you expect something and you're disappointed, or some kind of situation that calling forth a sense of anxiety in you, or anger, or a sense of anticipation and fear. And I was thinking about how do I turn the other cheek? How do I turn the other cheek? Because the mind and my consciousness has been so focused on, this is not right, it should be like this, and I realized that whenever that happens, whenever that inner state gets caught up in the other stressful state, no matter what it is, it's time for me to pause. It's time to stop. It's time to not do anything. It's time to begin to go into a place of prayer. It's like Jesus would go up to the mountain, and he would be up there for hours and hours. And I heard somebody say it wasn't because he had a long prayer list. That's not why Jesus was up there. He was up there in the silence and the stillness, in the same way people in all cultures have talked about meditation, the Buddhists, the Hindus. It's about being in that place of stillness and calm presence where you realize the truth of who you are, the truth of who we all are as part of this amazing collective universe, knowing that the presence and the power of the divine is there for the good for each one of us all the time. And I don't know about you, but when I find myself in those places of kind of arguing with somebody who's not there, does anybody do that? You have this little conversation, and I found myself really being defensive, kind of creating my ammunition and my reason for why I was right. And so I was thinking about, what are some tools and how can I understand this more? Because I think this is really what Jesus is inviting us to do when he says, turn the other cheek. In the same way he's saying, hey, it's no big deal if you love the people that love you. How hard is that? But it's when we come into these places where we rub up against that part of our consciousness that isn't settled into a peaceful place, knowing the truth of who we are. We find ourselves feeling angry with somebody because they didn't do what we wanted, or we're anxious and we're upset, whatever that is. That's when we need to turn the other cheek. But for most of us, we don't have the capacity to just move out of that space right away. That's, for me, often why I find the whole affirmation and denial piece is not a bang, bang. It's not like, oh, I'm going to do the denial, I got rid of it, now I can affirm it, and I'm ready, good to go. Is anybody here able to do that? You get a high mark, and there's a lot more, there's more there, There's more underneath all that really gives us what we need to be able to literally turn the other cheek and move out of that state of anger, resentment, whatever, into a state of feeling peaceful and calm, and then knowing what to say, what to do, or nothing, which is sometimes the best course of action. So I was looking at one of the Unity teachers. His name is Gary Simmons. And maybe some of you have read his book, The Eye of the Storm, which was probably 15 or 20 years ago. But he has a saying in this book that is, nothing and no one is against you. Nothing and no one is against you. And that kind of tied right in for me with Jesus' teaching about, when you think somebody's harming you, you have to understand that nothing and no one is really against you. So I was looking more deeply at Gary Simmons' work and trying to kind of see how he was framing this idea. Because again, when I read that, doesn't that kind of scramble your head a little bit? Nothing and no one is against you? Because it feels like in our culture there's a lot of against, isn't there? We live in an against place. There's lots of people pushing. So I wanted to go a little bit deeper and see how Gary was talking about this, to see if I could understand how it relates. And I thought, he's kind of he's a little subversive too. He's kind of a radical in his own way, that he speaks like this, because he kind of scrambles your brain. Basically what he is saying is that Whenever we find ourselves in a place where we're feeling any of these feelings, I don't know what your personal favorite is. We're feeling anxious, we're feeling angry, we're resentful, we're upset about something somebody did, we're disappointed. I mean, there's probably a list of 100 words that we could pick. Those emotional states that cause turmoil in us, that cause issues in the physical body even. But whenever we're feeling that, it's as if we're feeling something is against us. We're not experiencing the truth of who we are in the world. And the truth of who we are really is that the universe is there for you. He tells a story about his previous wife, who is no longer alive, but he wrote this book, and the main part of the book is that nothing and no one is against you, and his wife had cancer. And she was really mad. She said, "How can you say this? I have cancer. And he said, "This is not the truth of who you are. Cancer is not against you. Cancer is not against you. You have to begin to see that who you are as a spiritual being is separate from the experiences that you're having in your life. So your being is this dynamic, expansive energy of the divine presence that's a spiritual being having a human experience. But the cancer is an experience that the being is having. It's not who the being is. The cancer doesn't equal the being." And when his wife began to really get this at a very deep level, that her cancer was not who she was, she began to just have this incredible sense of gratitude in her life, gratitude for just holding on to the truth of who she was. And he says that during this time, she became radiant, literally became this very radiant being. So when she crossed over, she was in just a very, very peaceful place. And it was this separation from the sense of being that we have, from the sense of the experiences that we have over here, the being that we are from the experiences that we have. And that's what he's trying to help us understand, and I think that's part of what Jesus is doing as well. He's having us begin to look at the difference between how we identify with a particular situation as an aspect of who we are. And he's asking us to literally, Gary Simmons says, whenever you find yourself in a situation where feels like there's confusion or a disconnect or an incongruousness between what you know about who you are as a spiritual being and the feeling that you have to ask yourself, who am I being that's not really who I am? Am I being an angry person? Am I being a resentful person? You have to ask yourself, what's going on inside me that's making me name this experience as who I am? When I'm feeling unworthy, like somebody says something to me and all of a sudden, how could they say that? I'm angry. That unworthiness is not the truth of who I am. So this is a beautiful exercise for us to begin to understand more deeply Jesus' teaching on turning the other cheek. We need to begin to look inside to see what it is that causes disturbance in us. And from that place of knowing the truth about who we are, we separate the being, the spiritual being, from the experience that we're having. And we don't need to make anybody else wrong. We need to see who we are. It's an opportunity, in a sense, for us to clear ourselves of things that are no longer true about who we are as spiritual beings. So I think this is just a beautiful teaching, not only that Jesus has given us about being more clear in consciousness, but also I loved what Gary Simmons has begun to kind of unfold for me, because I think it's so easy to blame other people for the feelings that we're having, or blame the experience, or blame the news. And we have to look inside and see, what's going on inside me? What have I taken on as an identity in order to be angry at that person? So I invite us to take a moment right now. Let's close our eyes. Thanks, Guy. So take a moment and just reflect on your week. breathing into the presence and power of the divine that you are, the infinite, creative, loving presence of the divine. You are the vibration of love. And anything other than that whole and healthy, whole and vibrantly harmonizing presence of peace is simply not the truth of who you are. So reflecting back on this week, become aware if there was a particular situation where you were feeling upset about something. Maybe somebody said something to you that caused an upset. You felt it in the body. You felt a reaction. Maybe you wanted to say something back that might not have been your best words coming from the highest place of who you are. But just take a moment to reflect back on that particular situation and be aware that whatever you were experiencing in that moment, that experience being what somebody might have said or done or what you saw, that elicited a feeling inside you that you became identified with. Just notice what that feeling was. And because nothing, no thing is against you. No thing, no one is actually against you. The universe is conspiring for your highest and best. Be aware that whatever feeling you were having was coming up just to show you something that you are not, and to remind you of the truth of who you are. A truth that allows you to literally turn away from anger, from retaliation, from resentment, from even exchange in terms of how you act in the world. And to come back to the truth, to the creativity, to the power, the presence of love that you are in the moment, trusting and knowing that you are a divine child, inheriting the goodness and grace of God. Moving forward, become aware moment to moment as you move through your day that there is no one and no thing against you, that you are always this divine spiritual being having a human experience and in any moment able to turn the other cheek, to take a pause, to go to the mountain and pray, be in the stillness, discover what got churned up inside you, and to come back, take authentic spiritual action, speak words of truth, or simply rest in the knowing that the divine has given you a gift by understanding more of who you are. So knowing these deep wisdom teachings of Jesus, we give thanks for the presence and power of this grace in our lives and in the world. We say thank you. Thank you, God. Thank you, unity. So it is. Gently, as you're ready, you can bring your awareness back into your body and open your eyes.